What up, guys? How you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be reacting to a heated debate on gender pronouns and free speech in Toronto. Hey, let's get into it.
Campus this month. Some people on the campus saying pronouns like he, she, him, or her do not represent them accurately. Now, the university wants staff to use alternate pronouns, but Jordan Peterson is a psychology professor at the university, and he is refusing to do that. Take a look at this.
The reason I'm defending freedom of speech is because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis. I'm speaking out the way I'm speaking out because I think this is a route to no violence. And violence is lurking. And you can say that that sounds like a threat.
There was no violence at our protest, though.
I just asked, would you refer to me if it wasn't for this law, and I asked you to refer to me with they, them pronouns, would you? And your answer was no.
Not if I was compelled to.
But we're saying...
So just an example of how things have become heated at the University of Toronto. That scene showing different...
You know, I've been listening to Jordan Peterson a lot throughout the pandemic. His content, it really helped me as a young man trying to find myself in a different country, in a different space. His content, I'll be one to say, it helped me, man, because you have to find yourself, especially in the pandemic when we're going through that dark time of loneliness out here, and you're stuck at home and you're feeling bad and feeling sad. His content was just there. He's like the father that you never had, that advice, that mentor that you never had, and it's through the internet. So it's fascinating to see him, the man that I saw, and to see him leading a protest. I'm like, wait, that's not the Jordan Peterson that I know. But at the end of the day, it also shows me how much he's willing to stand up for the causes that he cares for, which makes this video far more interesting for me now.
Different groups of students, some confronting the professor about his position, others supporting him. Now, Peterson says this is about free speech, but A.W Peet is also a professor at the University of Toronto who says that Peterson's language is abusive. Joining us right now is Professor Jordan Peterson, as well as Professor A.W Peet. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Professor Peterson, let's begin with you. Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Well, we have a graphic to show our audience.
Radical ideologues. I have no idea what that means.
At home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them, you see here Z or Zim, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or A rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there. Professor Peet, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. In New Zealand, where I grew up, academics have a statutory role enshrined in the Education Act to be a critic and conscience of society. So I think that's an idea worth exporting to Canada. So I'd like to give Peterson about a B+ for his critic role recently, and an F for the conscience part. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. It's a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So, for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. And it's also absurd. I mean, here's one thing that's happened that I don't believe the formulators of this legislation ever foresaw. So in New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities. And I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And that absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Well, sorry, excuse me.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. It's quite interesting because, you know, one thing I realized in Western society, this concept of freedom of speech, it's a concept that where I'm from, it's you have freedom of speech, but you don't necessarily have freedom after your speech. Whereas here, it's I have freedom of speech and I have freedom after speech. But with such legislation that they're trying to put in, it simply means now that you don't really have the freedom of speech, right? Because there are certain things that you can and cannot say, whether you agree or disagree, because government enforces it. So if once you start putting in place legislation that dictates how you say zim, I don't know what that is, zim, whatever that is, pe, like that stuff, like that was on there when we started this. You set a precedence, because if someone is thinking, imagine if it's illegal to say to someone, oh, talk to him, and then they're like, no, that's not how what do they say? I recognize it, so now it's going to jail for that. You know what I mean? Like, it creates a precedence that's totally dangerous. So I agree with Mr. Peterson on this one.
Excuse me for jumping in, but I want to bring in Professor Peet here, because we did show those words to our audience at home, and perhaps the control room can show it to our audience once again. When you look at those alternate pronouns, I think it's fair to say that some people will see that at home and see that as very unwieldy, if you will. What do you say to those types of criticisms, including the one that you just heard from Professor Peterson?
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. You know, we call somebody what they want to be called in our society. For instance, I don't call somebody Julie if they prefer to be called Jordan. That's just basic human courtesy. Here's a great little tip for people who are despairing at the possibility of remembering all those pronouns. What I do is just program in the pronoun next to the person's name in my smartphone. So whenever I'm out and about and I've forgotten whether one of my trans friends uses ze or zer or they or them or something else, I just look it up and it's really super easy. One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centered in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the center of attention in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people, it's about protections for transgender people. And that's not, it's not about Jordan Peterson. So, we should have people learning to listen more. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a very good reason. When things get political, I like to ask who benefits and who gets to decide the rules of the game. So, mostly with this Peterson controversy, which is really just a small drama, a tempest in a teapot, he could just get over learning to program a few pronouns into his phone. By the way, I only have half a dozen or so that I actually use on an everyday basis, so it's not all that difficult.
Professor Peterson, sorry, Professor Peterson, good jumping, because I think Professor Peterson.
Man, this is the thing, man. Like, forgive me, Professor. I have a challenge. They didn't even make a point there is no point that they raised in this argument. He raised points. He said this legislation creates a precedence, right? Which will result in a lot of absurd things occurring. Like, for example, some stupid stuff. People can start getting people sent to jail, and then they come in and say, no, save someone's name. The issue is, I don't know these people. I just met them. Okay, and they're trying to do something. This thing that these people have of trusting in people and believing in the goodness of humanity. It's like, how many times, man? How many times do humans need to be proven that, yo, there's some shady characters out there, and if you don't prepare for these shady characters, and if you don't like be paranoid to an extent and look at things in a broader perspective, you're setting yourself up for trouble. Like, I don't get it. I don't understand it. Like, what? I apologize. All right. They, them. Hey, man, I'm still catching up to some of these
Peterson
things.
wants to get in on that.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, you know, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, you know, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all.
But
so, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely
How do
in
you
case
remember
we
names,
offend
Jordan?
someone.
Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first name, you remember their telephone number. I mean, I think that it's
I don't
very,
remember
very
people's
true
first names
that
very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
That's you
they
being
appear
lazy,
that way.
Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's a very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn. So, you know, trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social justice... Am I a social justice warrior? I don't know. But I think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering independent cultural traditions of minorities, and being willing to share power with people who are different than you. I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month. For example, have you recently had a bank employee accuse you of trying to masquerade as yourself at a bank and then locking down your ATM card and credit card so that you can't use any money? Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, you know, considering suicide. These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked
I
to a
didn't
few
know
trans
them.
people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Peet,
Yo, this desire to be victims is a problem. You know what I mean? Like, I feel there's a challenge with minorities, or at some point want to be minorities. It's, you want to be a victim so bad because certain groups have made it look cool. So certain groups have had to suffer and have had to find joy and happiness within their work, to whereby when it comes to these issues, like what are we talking about? They just raised some valid points, getting discrimination in terms of banking. That can be a conversation we should be having. Like, oh, how do we help transgender people sort out their banking, find housing, find this? How do we get society to accept that we have a group of people that are different from what we've already lived with? But now we find ourselves having to debate pronouns and having to remember every time that when you're looking at somebody, it's not a he or she, it's a they, and a long list of things that you have to remember. Call people because you have to save it in your phone number. It's like, that's not really an issue, man. Come on. There are better issues that we should be fighting for, conversations we should be having, not the ones that we're having right now. I find this problematic, man. Like, like, come on.
Professor Peet, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected you either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself and on behalf of other people perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. And so I'm not taking...
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion. No. Because it's the way that you present yourself in public with your clothing and your manner of dress. And so I also think that the legislation that we are bringing forth with Bill C-16, and that's already in place in places like Ontario, also makes fashion criticism something akin to a hate crime. And because there's been so much noise about the identity component of this, we haven't even talked about gender expression. This is appalling legislation. And the idea that referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice is going to radically improve their status in society or their mental health is a completely unproven assumption. I think it'll have exactly the opposite effect.
Professor Peet, I want to ask you, because it's been brought up a couple of times, to Professor Peterson's point, if this was so popular, if this was so needed, there would be a natural evolution. There wouldn't be need for legislation. Why the need for legislating this as opposed to allowing it to evolve naturally?
Well, Bill C-16 and the Ontario Human Rights Code do not actually legislate pronoun usage. They don't specify 31 genders or anything of the kind.
But let me jump in, though. The university is essentially telling, at this point, it's human resources people to use alternate pronouns, in a way legislating their staff to do this.
No, the legislation also requires it, and the university made clear their concordance with that assumption on my part by mentioning in the letter that asked me to silence myself that I'm required to act in accordance with the provisions of the Ontario Human Rights Act. And so the university knows full well that the legislation does precisely what I suggest it does. It's not written precisely in Bill C-16, it's written in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And if you read the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies on such things, you'll see very rapidly that utilization of preferred pronouns is part of the legislative package. So
and they're actually, if you read the legislation, Jordan, you will find out that they're actually called correct pronouns. There's no preference about this.
There is on the Ontario.
What's correct for a person.
There is on the Ontario Human Rights Commission website where the policy is laid out, and if people don't believe that, they can just go look themselves.
Professor Peet, when you hear that this is a free speech issue, that you hear Professor Peterson and this.
First of all, this is not a heated debate. This is just, it's one of those debates whereby, once again, you have an academia with information debating facts and points, and then you have another person who's emotionally attached to the conversation and topic at hand, that it's not a debate. It's I don't know what it is.
In this case, essentially
An
saying that he
argument.
doesn't want to be legislated to adopt new language. What's your response to that?
Well, I share a number of Jordan's concerns about freedom of speech and academic freedom on campus. These are both very, very important principles, and they should apply regardless of what kind of politics you like. For example, if you're a left-winger or a right-winger or an up-winger or a down-winger or whatever it is. But you know, the reason why we have laws that protect academic freedom and freedom of speech is primarily to prevent government interference in individuals' lives, in their business. It's there really mostly to protect against a form of structural violence. And these free speech laws were actually never intended to be used as all-purpose accountability shields, you know, so that you don't have to be held accountable for your actions.
I'm perfectly willing to be held accountable for my actions, and the university has already indicated the seriousness with which they view my actions. And I also do not believe that free speech laws were there to protect, to regulate violence. Free speech laws are there because we use free speech to identify problems in our society, generate solutions to the problems, and then reach a consensus. So freedom of speech is actually is protection for the mechanism by which our individuals and society properly orient themselves across time. It's not even a principle, it's the fundamental method by which our societies manage to maintain the stability that they do maintain. And so
it's one of the ways we do that, yes.
Well, I would say that it's the fundamental way. So, and I mean, I think we could have a reasonable discussion about that, but because freedom of speech is so tightly tangled up with the means by which we solve problems, I mean, I think, you know, and then I talk, but I get corrected when I speak publicly, and the fact that I'm being corrected constantly by the people that I'm speaking with helps orient my speech properly and helps orient public discussion properly. And I can tell you, too, that if there wasn't something absolutely vital at stake here that had a lot more to do than with just simple kindness, there wouldn't have been millions of people watching, for example, the assault that took place during the free speech rally that was held a few days after I released the video, which I see that CBC conveniently omitted to include in their video clips at the beginning of this interview.
Well, Professor Peterson, we do want to thank you. We're sorry we're out of time here, but I want to thank both of you for joining us today. That is the University of Toronto professors Jordan Peterson and A.W Peet, talking about what has become a very big controversy at the University of Toronto and beyond.
Man, you know, we live in a tricky time, man, because you want to be politically correct, but you want to be yourself and be able to express how you think and how you feel. The challenge that we have is once we have legislation, that often leads into suppression of what you can actually say. And what tends to happen with a lot of groups, especially because we live now in a liberal world, is people do not really think long term and what are the possibilities. There's this belief that people are inadvertently good. It's like people just believe that people are good people, that we have good intentions and will always do good things. But over time, we've learned that humans are not always going to do good things. And with great power, you know, people become corrupt and do certain things to advance themselves. I come from a nation where we didn't have free speech, and I value free speech. So when you come to a country where people start to lobby for anti-free speech, you're like, hey, hold up, wait a minute. Whatever you're advocating for in terms of if you're not introducing your pronouns, they, them, zim, zim, them, whatever they were putting up, society will pick it up and take it and create these words. You know, language evolves, but without government influence. People just go, oh, this is morally incorrect. This is more morally correct. Let's move this way. Let's move in a different way. And then just like that, everything is fixed. But I think what's been happening a lot of times is a lot of things are now politicized. So any issue that comes up that makes a lot of noise, it's politicized and becomes a political issue rather than a social issue which society has to solve. It's a political issue which is used to advance a political statement or a political move for somebody who benefits from somewhere. In this instance, you know, it's sad that you get to see a group of minority, a group of people being used. In this case, maybe by social justice warriors, maybe, I don't know who benefits from all of this, but that's my take, is there's a lot of issues we could be sitting down, me reacting to, people having conversations about, rather than us sitting down and communicating in terms of, I don't want to be called a he, him, her, whatever. Like, come on. They just brought up valid points when they say, you know, they were getting turned away from a bank. That is an issue. They don't have housing. That is an issue. People are being suicidal. That is an issue. The mental health of transgender folks. Those are issues that we should be able to sit down, have a conversation about. Whether you call someone he, they, whatever you call them, come on, man. There are better issues in this world. Let me know in the comment section what you think. And yeah, see you in the next one.